Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. I just wanted to kick off by saying thank you so much for being here. I'm Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, and I represent a district in Florida's 7th Congressional District. I serve on the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, and this is the first in a series of briefings that I plan on holding around various issues related to trade, since it affects so much of America's economy and security. I think the conversations are useful. Today's topic is going to be U.S. China trade conflict, and we have an incredible panel with really deep experience and academic expertise, practical experience and academic expertise, and the audience should have received a document with their bios. The format will just basically be that our panelists will give some short remarks, and then we'll open up to Q&A from me and other members as well as the audience. While I want to turn it over to our panel of experts as soon as possible, I hope you'll indulge me with a few words just to frame this event. You know, I think trade matters so much because it stands at the intersection of both domestic policy and foreign policy. And it really has a significant impact on the quality of life here in the United States, as well as on the quality of relationships that we have abroad. And, you know, it has the ability to have a positive impact or a negative impact. But it's definitely going to have some sort of impact. So I think it's really important that we get our trade policy right. I think our panelists would probably agree that we're in the middle of one of the most consequential and maybe even controversial periods in trade policy in our nation's history. Trade has really moved from the margins to the center of our national conversations. It's really hard today to turn on TV or look at the papers and not see some article about the impact of trade, how it's reverberating through our society and our economy. And I think that's true, especially as it relates to U.S. China trade. I also think it's fair to say that the public's growing interest in trade is largely a result of the Trump administration's trade-related actions, which, you know, wherever you are on them, whether you love them or hate them, they are extremely assertive. And, you know, as a member of Congress, this probably should come as no surprise to you. I'm a big fan of Article 1, and I believe in the balance of powers, and I think it's critical that Congress, which has constitutional authority over foreign commerce, I think it's critically important that we conduct oversight of the executive branch's trade agenda and with the same amount of assertiveness that they're embarking on their trade agenda. And I think, you know, we can support the administration where appropriate and push back when necessary. That, after all, is our role as a co-equal branch of government. So, you know, alongside the effort to modernize our trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, I think America's trade dispute with China is by far the most urgent trade issue on our docket. And one could argue that it is actually the trade issue that is having the most real significant economic impacts today, with the possibility of making permanent change to our economy and the trading system. And you all should have received a document prepared by CRS that summarizes the chronology and the nature of the ongoing tariff conflict between U.S. and China. So today, my hope is that we can break down this fairly complex issue by seeking answers to four simple questions. First, what are the Trump administration's goals? What does it hope to achieve with respect to China? And what specific Chinese policies and practices do we find objectionable? The second thing is, has the administration's main tool, which is the use of tariffs, been effective? Have they actually helped to achieve the goals that they set out to do? Have they made any progress towards achieving those goals? And third, how have these tariffs and the counter tariffs that China has placed on U.S. exports affected the U.S. economy, the U.S. companies, and U.S. workers? Has the impact been severe or substantial or slight? And to what industries have they been felt more significantly? I think we are fortunate we have panelists who can speak to the impact of current and potential tariffs and counter tariffs on agriculture, retail, and technology sectors. There's also been significant impact on the manufacturing sector, so I hope we can discuss that in the Q&A or otherwise. And then fourth and finally, are there realistic alternative policy approaches that can more likely achieve the legitimate U.S. objectives vis-a-vis China and are less likely to damage American economic interest in the process. You know, naturally, I do have a personal perspective on these questions, driven largely by the input that I receive from my constituents, and I've heard an awful lot about these trade policies when I'm at home. I think, you know, while China's unfair trade and investment practices really violates the letter and spirit of its WTO commitments, I've always believed that we need to work in a strong, smart, and strategic way to compel China to change course. At the same time, I think, you know, the Trump administration's primary tool, which is tariffs, has done more damage to the United States than to China, and it has done little to get China to change its problematic conduct. And it's been deployed unilaterally without meaningful involvement, much less the blessing of Congress. And we are the folks who are most close to the American businesses and consumers who are affected by these policies. I think we should have a role in this process. You know, the use of tariffs has resulted in what is essentially a significant tax on American consumers and businesses. It's also resulted in a reduction of export markets, and in order to compensate for that, pretty large subsidies to certain industries to compensate for the harm inflicted by our own government. I think it has the potential to really change the way trade, the U.S. role in international trade. So, having said all of that, I do believe that perhaps the administration could have taken a different set of trade policies and maybe worked more in collaboration with our allies to achieve its goals. But I am open to hearing from the experts on this. With all that said, let me turn it over to our great panelists. I'll introduce them really quickly and then let them speak for a few minutes. We'll start with Matt Goodman from CSIS. He used to serve on the NSC staff as Director of International Economics, and before that as the Director for Asian Economic Affairs. And then we'll hear from Ambassador Darcy Vetter. Darcy served in the last administration as the Chief Agricultural Negotiator in the Office of the USTR. She'll help us understand the impact of this trade conflict on American farmers and food manufacturers. And then we'll hear from Brian Dodge, who is the COO of the Retail Industry Leaders Association. My district, like many congressional districts, has a large number of workers employed in the retail sector, over 40,000. Brian's going to discuss the impact we see on this sector and the impact we could see if this tariff war escalates further. And then after that, we'll turn it over to Josh Calmer. Josh is the Executive VP of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council. He can talk about how U.S. tech companies have been affected by the tariff war on both the import and export side. And then our final speaker will be Chad Bown, an economist at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. He previously served in the White House's Council of Economic Advisors, and Chad is also the co-host of an excellent podcast, and I commend it to you, Trade Talks, which has delved pretty deeply into the U.S.-China trade conflict, and he'll discuss his general views, especially on any key points that weren't touched on by other panelists. So with that, let's begin with Matt.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Delighted to be here, honored to be here with this great panel. So I am going to try to frame this set of challenges with China, step back a little bit. And I think first, just a note from the handout that you have and the chronology, which is very helpful, just a reminder that this trade war kind of officially began only on July 6th, 2018. 16 plus months ago. A lot of bluster and other things happening before that, but that was when the first tariffs were imposed by the United States and China on the same day. And so it's a relatively recent thing, and an awful lot has happened, and it's hard. It's you get a sore neck from trying to follow the back and forth here, and there's a lot more than even what's reflected here. But this had been building for a long time. I mean, certainly going back to when Chad and I worked together in the White House in the early part of this decade to mid-2000s, going backwards, when China started investing in these indigenous innovation policies that I think are the source of a lot of the technology-related questions we have today, or right back to when China joined the WTO in 2001. I was also in government then, is it not close enough? Sorry. I was also in government then, and almost within days of China joining the WTO in December 2001, we were already preparing to file cases under this famous 421 statute that took several years to actually be implemented when the Obama administration did the tires case. But there was already a concern about China's new position in the trading environment. So this goes back a long time. I think, that you could imagine in a parallel universe, if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, I think up to that point of July 6th last year, a lot of the same things could have happened. You could imagine a Clinton USTR filing a 301 report very similar to the one that was issued in March of last year. You could imagine that it would be focused on these technology transfer issues, intellectual property, subsidization, other problems in China, because these were things that were already changing in China. I think the point I want to make here is that China is really the source of this problem, not us. I mean, there's a lot of sort of noise around what Trump has done, and you've asked some good questions about his policies, but I think it's important to understand it was China that was changing in several ways. It became bigger, a lot bigger, and it introduced some deliberate policies to try to succeed in some specific sectors by throwing a lot of government money, by restricting the competitive landscape. And I think all of this stuff was building up, and I think some kind of response was needed. And I think in that sense, as you said, the Trump administration being more assertive about this has helpfully raised attention to those issues. So there's a lot of continuity here. Let me just say, though, it's not just about trade. In fact, I'd say one thing that would be really different if we had a different leadership now here is I think it'd be less about trade, qua trade. It would be more about, I think, investment, first of all, in both directions. American companies having trouble succeeding in the Chinese market, new sort of neuralgia growing about Chinese investment in the United States. I think that would have been probably the central organizing part of this, and that has become now part of the conversation in both directions. And that leads me to say that, there's a bunch of other stuff beyond trade policy that is happening now, and this is expanding into investment policy with the new FIRMA law that is restricting foreign or screening, tightening the screening of foreign investment. Other countries are adopting similar approaches. We were just in Europe last week and talking to the European Commission and others about this. You have, of course, a lot of that is focused on technology, and that's really at the heart of this, and we'll hear from Josh and others about that, I'm sure. You have now currency being brought back into the story with China finally being, again, declared a currency manipulator after 25 years in August of this year. You have talk about possible capital controls on investment to China by American companies or pension funds, government pension funds. So this is sort of metastasizing into a bunch of other areas, and I think all those things are worth your committee watching as well, because they go beyond just trade. Final thing, I'll just say what I would do, and to your point of being, I think you said strong, smart, and strategic. I love that. What I think is strong, smart, and strategic, and I usually use my hand as a prop here, I think we need to do 5 things. We need to protect the crown jewels. That means, these investment screening processes, export controls, other things to ensure that our critical technology is protected. I think we need to enforce the rules and brush China back when it violates the rules, and that's where tariffs come in, but there are other tools as well. Thirdly, and this is the part that's most missing from the Trump administration approach, we need to have a proactive strategy of promoting trade and other rules that are in our likeness and not China's, and incentivizing others to join us. That was the power of TPP, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure. And then finally, or my last finger here before I get to the thumb, is we need to invest in ourselves. I mean, we need to invest in our own R&D capabilities, our own infrastructure, our own education and skills. And the thumb wraps it all together, because that's allies. Working with allies, and again, across all of those issues, is critical. If we don't do that, it's not going to work. None of those things individually will work without allied coordination. And I would also, maybe as a footnote, say also within our own government, we need to be more coordinated, and the White House needs to take more control of this strong, smart, and strategic approach. So I'll stop there.
you very much. I think Matt's comments are actually a very good jumping off point for mine. His principles, certainly good things to keep in mind. I've been asked to comment a little bit on the agriculture sector and how the current trade tensions with China are affecting that. And, you know, first of all, I think we should not be surprised when we see the impact that these retaliatory tariffs, those tariffs taken by China in retaliation for our actions, are having on U.S. agriculture. Agriculture is almost always front and center when it comes to retaliatory actions like that. We are an export-oriented sector, so it's sort of an easy target. They know we're dependent on those foreign markets. There is agriculture in nearly every district and in all 50 states, so politically it can be very convenient to target particular products to try and get the attention of the people in this room, to try and reverse the policies that countries are concerned about. And, you know, certainly in this case, we also have to consider that while the 301 tensions began in July, the steel and aluminum tensions began before that. And farmers really are finding themselves in a place where they're being squeezed on both sides. Their inputs are more expensive, whether they want to build a new machine shed or mend some fence or buy a tractor, their steel and aluminum is now much more expensive. And on the other side, the retaliatory tariffs they face are stopping specific sales to China. So again, reducing the amount that they may be able to sell. But that decrease in demand is also backing up and having an overall depressing effect on price. So I think we often hear about lost exports. We don't think about sometimes in commodity markets that what that does is put U.S. ag products in a place where they're selling at a discount to some of their competitors, where in the past, the United States' ability to be able to deliver on spec and on time really put us at a premium. So we're seeing the opposite being true. And there are lots of charts and graphs out there with soybeans as sort of the poster child for how our exports have suffered. But I would say we should think beyond that and think about the potential and the current state of China as an agricultural trading partner. This has had a big impact on dairy, on sorghum, on lots of other products as well. Don't forget that a lot of the agricultural byproducts, which also have value, hides and skins for leather, feathers to make down, a lot of those things go to China. And in the current state of trade, essentially everything in the agricultural stream that we send to China is now affected by these tariffs and less competitive into that market. So soybeans are absolutely important. They're that number one export, but this is broadly felt across the sector. It's also fair to recall that this is 1.5 billion people, 1.6 billion person market that has continued to see rising incomes, rising demand, a rising market while we take a back seat. So there's a real lost opportunity to grow those exports into the sector. And, we have to remember that there's been some talk about these tariffs being sort of policy in and of themselves, that should we take some time to decouple from our dependence on that Chinese market, 1.5 billion consumers are going to be swaying globally ag markets depending on where they purchase. Their decisions will change trade flows for U.S. products, whether it's just a direct change or if Brazil is now sending its beans, where do our beans go to sort of fill that hole? So they're going to hold a sway over what's happening in ag markets, even if we're not directly engaged. And so direct engagement, being able to fill those markets in the most efficient way is really in our interest. A lot of the focus, of course, has been on the tariffs themselves and on how agriculture is being affected negatively. But we do have a proactive set of concerns with China as well. And, Matt mentioned this. A number of them center around sanitary and phytosanitary barriers to our products, that is, regulations about plant and animal health and human food safety. China, it was notoriously slow to reopen the market for U.S. beef after BSE. That has now been opened, but the protocol by which we would send beef is very restrictive, and of course it is now also affected by a retaliatory tariff. That's a product that could see some work. The poultry opening that was just announced is absolutely important and a big deal. And we want to see that protocol, we want to see that be able to be used. There are very difficult dairy registration and certification requirements that make it difficult for us to send our dairy products. Again, 1.6 billion customers who are eager to increase their protein intake. Huge opportunity in dairy as well. But I think it's important to, as we think about what we're negotiating with China on agriculture, detailed protocols for how we would reopen those markets, should be on the agenda. My understanding is they are part of those discussions. Again, opening and making easier the process for approving biotech events for our grain producers, important as well. But all of those SPS-related types of regulations or protocols that we want to negotiate, you don't know if they're going to work until you test them. So it's one thing to say we're reopening the market for U.S. poultry. The next time there is an outbreak of high-path avian influenza, which is what had closed the market in the first place, and there will be a next time. There is animal disease. There are food safety recalls and events. That's when you find out if the protocol really works. And those protocols have to be, of course, detailed and have buy-in from both sides and have to be based somewhat on trust, that our regulatory officials are going to work together to provide each other and trust each other with that scientific information so that the other side feels comfortable reopening to those products. Now, China has not been a good actor here. I think they have found multiple reasons to keep our market closed long after other regulators were comfortable in other countries, and that has been a difficult issue. But there are relationships that need to be tended to and fostered to make sure that our regulators work together well, and it would be, I think, helpful to pay more attention, again, not just to the trade, but to think about how our trading systems work together. The third thing I would say, I do want to mention subsidies in that, this administration has moved forward with the case that was taken in the last administration against China's agricultural subsidy spending, particularly for wheat, rice, and corn. I think if you look at that, continues to be a problem and is one where I hope we will continue to follow up on that issue. But it is one that I think there are folks in China who also recognize that China should not be growing a lot of corn, that the internal support price China had maintained for corn was changing production decisions in a way that was very hard on their natural resources. Corn requires a lot of water, which China doesn't have. Corn requires a lot of chemical inputs on land that is already, in many cases, degraded or contaminated, challenges that China has in its own ag future. And so we do have some internal champions, I think, for that reform. And again, relationships to help figure out how to move that forward are important. Last but not least, I think the headlines over the last couple of weeks have been on, getting close to this phase one deal, that a major hang-up has been the level of agricultural purchases that China would make, and that we want them to do $50 billion. Is that over 2 years? Is it 1 year? Is it annually for a number of years? Would we require quarterly or monthly updates on how much they were purchasing? And that seems to me to be focusing in the wrong place. And that, volume of purchases could in some ways be counterproductive to the long-term relationship we want to have with the Chinese. First of all, if you go back to the highest number of exports on record, 2014, from the U.S. of ag products to China, that's about $24+ billion. So $50 billion in a year would be twice the record level of exports. It would really require that China buy only from us for a number of products in order to hit that number. And, ultimately, what we've been saying is we want China to perform like a market economy. But in order to purchase that many ag products, we would be saying, don't behave like a market economy. And they would have to use their state trading mechanisms as the primary importer to do this. What we would like to have is an ag sector that has strong relationships with private enterprise, that is actually meeting the specific needs that they have at the right time, where we become that supplier of choice deeply ingrained in their ag sector. And I think forcing through ag purchases of things that they may not need right now would cause, again, those displacements. If they purchase only from us, where do we divert otherwise good and solid exports from to fill that Chinese demand? Which markets does China push aside to purchase only from the U.S.? So I don't think we end up with that strong, deep market relationship we want if we're focused on a number and not on the system. So with that.
Morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion today. I'm excited to represent the perspective of the retail industry, the impact on retailers, and ultimately consumers as well. When retailers source the products that they sell from here in the U.S., domestically, and of course all around the world, and when they make their sourcing decisions, they factor in a number of considerations, including product quality, manufacturing capacity, and value for the ultimate consumer. Today's discussion is focused primarily on tariffs, and specifically tariffs on imported goods from China. Applying tariffs to goods coming from China immediately increases the cost of impacted goods. However, it doesn't impact the other dynamics that retailers consider. And so, as a result, the supply chains that retailers maintain, which are built over decades, are well established and very difficult to move. And so applying tariffs, while it increases the cost of the goods that are impacted, it doesn't change those other dynamics. It doesn't, neither in China nor necessarily in other markets. It doesn't suddenly present additional skills to alternative markets. It doesn't change the infrastructure in other countries. And so, by and large, retailers and ultimately consumers are captive to the supply chains as they exist today, which means that the products that cost more for retailers will ultimately be reflected in the cost that consumers pay. Representative Murphy, you said at the outset that there is good and bad about trade, and there's certainly there's bad as it results to tariffs, because tariffs are taxes. Tariffs are taxes that ultimately consumers pay, and that is of considerable concern to us. The trade partnership estimates that if all of the tariffs go into effect, and the last tranche are slated to go into effect in a little over 3 weeks from now, the average household will pay about $2,300 more a year as a result of these tariffs. The products affected by this are discretionary items, but a lot of them are non-discretionary items: clothing, footwear, items of that sort. The kinds of items that low and middle income families on a tight budget will struggle to deal with that added cost, and it will affect their ability to spend more broadly. We are concerned about that. We think that the economy has been riding high for quite some time, that it has been driven in part by a very confident consumer who has felt the power to spend, and we want them to continue to do so. Higher costs on consumers will have a negative impact on their confidence, and ultimately could have an impact on their spending, and could really ground this economic high that we've been on for some time. We, as retailers, believe that we should operate within a rules-based trading system, and certainly believe that violators of the rules should be held accountable. We fundamentally believe, though, that the tariffs are not the right tool, that they ultimately have a harmful impact on American consumers, one that has not thus far shown the ability to compel the changes that have been sought through the tariffs in the first place. And so we are enthusiastic about the notion that a phase one deal could come about. We are hopeful that we will evaluate it based on the reduction of tariffs as a part of that deal. But ultimately, we want to see tariffs removed from Chinese imports and then we can employ some of the strategies that Matt outlined that would have greater effect on the behavior of China. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Representative Murphy, and to your colleagues for pulling together this really important discussion. I think my opening remarks will strongly resemble yours and also agree substantially with Matt's and Brian's as well. I want to make 3 quick points. The first is that we represent the entire tech sector, every part: hardware, software, services, internet, semiconductors. And we actually have thought from the beginning that the administration ought to be commended for taking the step that it took back in March of last year to fundamentally redefine the relationship with China. It's an action that no administration had taken. China has abused the privilege of being a member of the international trading system ever since it joined the WTO. We often refer to it as having a tapestry of policies and practices that systematically put a thumb on the competitive scale in favor of domestic entities and to the detriment of non-Chinese entities. And it's, much of what Matt said is absolutely right. Trade in goods is still incredibly important, but increasingly it's things like trade in services, foreign investment, IP, data flows, the setting of standards. These are all areas in which China has put a thumb on that scale and failed to play by the rules. So it was high time that an administration really worked to redefine the relationship. Point number 2, though, is that tariffs are not the right tool to do that. And it's just as Brian said, they're taxes, and they're taxes not just on American consumers, but on American firms and American workers. They increase the costs of finished products coming into the United States. They increase the costs of intermediate products coming into the United States. They reduce competitiveness in export markets, both because of those increased costs and because of the knock-on effect of retaliation that we've seen. And they affect the entire economy. And I think Chad probably has better statistics at his fingertips than I do, but we've seen decreases in exports. We've heard anecdotally from large numbers of our companies about the deleterious effects that this series of tariffs is having throughout their supply chains, on their abilities to compete with firms from elsewhere in the world. And so tariffs we have found to be an incredibly counterproductive method for addressing a very legitimate grievance and an objective that we share. The final point is that it's not too late. I mean, it's been about a year. We've, I guess, had tariffs in place for almost a year and a half. This process has been going on almost 2 years, but there is still an opportunity for the administration to do the hard work of building concerted international and coordinated action to address this. It would be nice if the right way to go about this were as simple and immediate as what we find to be the wrong way, but the reality is that it's not. And I spent a lot of time in Europe. I spent a lot of time in Asia. As unhappy, honestly, as a lot of our colleagues in those governments are about the level of cooperation that they've had with the United States in recent years, they still recognize the much larger shared strategic interest in working together to address these issues. And so we spend a ton of our time trying to serve as interlocutor, getting the parties to talk to each other, getting beyond the tactical differences and really focusing on the long term. I mean, this is a generationally significant set of things that's going on right now. And the U.S. has got to be partnering with Europe, with Japan, with other like-minded economies to address it. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks for me as well for the invitation to be here and for convening this. And I don't think I've disagreed with a word that's been said ahead of me. And so rather than just repeat everything that's already been said, perhaps I'll make 3 points. The first, as well, is to commend the administration for bringing to everyone's attention what is a legitimate set of concerns. But I think what I really want to focus on is how hard it is to win a trade war, and a tariff war especially. So as Matt laid out, this thing has really only been going on for 16 months or so, since July of 2018. But even the initial phase of the tariff, so this is kind of getting at the question is, why haven't we seen a massive impact yet on the U.S. economy? And we will, be able to talk about some impact on the U.S. economy, but, we're not in a recession, right? This wasn't the gloom and doom that some people might have predicted. And so why is that? Well, partially even the tariffs when they rolled out last year were rolled out relatively slowly, $34 billion, $16 billion, then 200. But the products that were targeted with those tariffs as well were primarily on intermediate inputs. It's not until these next two tranches of tariffs this year, the ones that we saw in September, that for the first time really hit a lot of consumer retail products for the first time, clothing, shoes, and then the December 15th tariffs that will really hit consumer electronics and toys and those types of things that are very, very different. And so, yes, the economic evidence that we have seen to date, the academics and other folks that have really studied the impact have found that the cost of these tariffs have largely been borne by Americans. American consumers, businesses have also had to, bite the bullet and suck up losses in profits when they haven't been able to necessarily pass along the full cost increase of the taxes, which is what these tariffs are to the end consumers. But so far, the evidence is that it's Americans that are bearing the cost of this. That may change over time, but that's what we know as of right now. Second main point is that China has responded, and we've heard about their retaliation, and I'm fully in agreement with the impact that that's had, especially on the American agricultural sector. But their approach in their retaliation has actually been quite a bit different than our approach in just applying massive tariffs almost across the board. China, first of all, has left some segments of its economy, of its imports from the United States, completely untouched by tariffs, recognizing that there are going to be, for a number of sectors, it would be very costly to their own economy to impose tariffs. So we haven't seen tariffs on aircraft. We haven't seen tariffs on semiconductors, some pharmaceutical products, where they're really reliant on the United States, right? They're sort of minimizing their act of self-harm. And the second thing that we have seen, and this is also important because it negatively impacts American companies and American workers and American exporters, during the trade war, one of China's responses has been to lower their tariffs toward everybody else in the world. They've lowered their tariffs toward everybody else in the world pretty significantly on a number of products. So yes, even in the soybean case, you don't have to lower your tariffs if you're China because they're 3%. You can just go buy them from Brazil and Argentina instead. But if you're a lobster fisherman or woman in Maine and you're now facing competition from Canadian lobster folks, they now face a lower tariff to be able to sell their product into the Chinese market than they did before the trade war. So China's response to this has just been very different, right? They're managing this as sort of an economic challenge in ways that we aren't. The third and final thing that I wanted to touch on was a little bit of the details about why it is so important to work with allies that have common interests in addressing these common concerns with China. And it's not simply that it's a kumbaya thing and that's just, all of us getting along should be the way to go. It's the pure economics that drives this. What China is doing, whether it's on subsidies, state-owned enterprises, mistreatment of investment in the Chinese market, mistreatment of intellectual property, this is not problems that they're doing that only affect American companies. They affect European companies, Japanese companies, Korean companies, all equally. And so by the United States, through its policy going it alone, effectively that's the Americans trying to work on behalf of the whole world, bearing all of the costs of the trade war on itself, fixing a problem that negatively impacts folks everywhere else around the world. And to some extent, yes, and I talk to the Europeans and the Japanese and government policymakers around the world as well. They're worried about the lack of coordination. But on the other hand, a lot of their businesses are now seeing opportunities that are being provided to them because of the way that China has engaged, by lowering their tariffs for the rest of the world, by treating their American competitors better in some sense. So this is not something that the Americans we can do by ourselves effectively. We kind of don't have the economic tolerance to fight this fight on behalf of the whole world. And so it doesn't make even economic sense for us to be pursuing this strategy. And so I'm hopeful we'll get into some of the questions about what are some of these alternative ways that we could be actually pursuing that. But thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for really great opening remarks. I think we'll move on to Q&A, and if my fellow colleagues have any, want to ask a question, just get my attention. And but if I can take the first question and ask, you all have talked a little bit about the impact that American companies and American consumers have faced. How do you assess the impact on Chinese companies and consumers in the Chinese economy? Are these tariffs having the intended consequence of applying economic pain, to compel China to change its behavior? Do you think that harm is being incurred over on the other side? And are we seeing signs that it's forcing China to make real structural changes, as opposed to coming to the table with, I think, as just purchase order negotiations?
I'll take a stab. Sorry, this closer. First stab at that. Yes, it is having impact in China. In fact, the median impact from a macroeconomic point of view of many economists who have tried to do early look at this is that, China may be hit as much as, 0.8% of GDP over this next year from the tariffs that have been put in place, whereas it's sort of 0.4 for us. So it's the impact on them at a macro level is higher. You can also see impacts in a more anecdotal, or at least, in a more qualitative sense. When I was in China a few weeks ago, you definitely got the sense that that the tariff war was complicated. It wasn't the cause of their problems. They have much deeper challenges in shifting their economy to a more sort of soft model of growth based on consumer spending and services and so forth. And there's huge challenges involved in that, not to mention financial strains and environmental strains and demographic problems. So they've got huge problems, but this is complicating that management of that process, and I think it explains why they are still at the table. Because frankly, after what happened in the spring, when we seemed to be close to a deal, and then famously in early May, that blew up, and I think that they felt that that they were. We weren't acting in good faith, that they weren't prepared to put the big structural changes on the table. To me, it was a little surprising they came back to the table, and I think the only explanation for that is that this is hurting them at the margin. It's not going to bring them down. It's not even that macro impact is not enormous, but it's enough to make them want to get this behind them. And I think they will see. I think phase one probably will happen because both presidents want it. I'm not going to predict a date, but that's always dangerous in forecasting. Pick a number or a date, as they say. But I think I think it will happen because of that. I think it's happening at the margins, and you see numbers about job losses in China. I mean, it is having some impact.
Did anybody else want to comment on that?
I'll just jump in and say, the stated purpose of the tariffs were to compel changes in the way that China operates. That hasn't happened. So I don't know that necessarily evaluating the impact, and I won't dispute the impact that's happening there, but it hasn't compelled the changes that we're looking for. We are now at a point where the American consumer is facing higher costs as a result of the tariffs. The $38 billion have been collected in higher tariffs over the course of the last year and a half. That seems like a strategy that isn't producing the desired results, and it's time to look for perhaps another way to get this done.
Chad?
I want to take a slightly different take maybe than Matt, which was, I think there's a risk that we overstate the amount of leverage that we have on the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is massive. And yes, their exports to the United States are down this year because of obviously the U.S. tariffs, but their exports to the rest of the world are up. Their economy was slowing before the trade war, for a number of different reasons, as Matt said. They're kind of shifting their model from an export-led manufacturing type of an economy to more services-oriented. You know, they've been slowing down their growth of credit over the last couple of years, and all of those things are going to just generally slow down their economy for reasons that are independent of the trade war. So I won't disagree too much. I do think the trade war is definitely having an impact, but I don't think we want to overstate just how big the impact it's going to have. And the second is, as the Chinese economy does inevitably slow down, if times don't go that well, I'm not sure we want to be the ones responsible for that. And the rhetoric that's been thrown around during the trade war, we really run the risk of creating a generation of Chinese that might look at the Americans as being responsible for some sort of economic challenges that they may face. And you know, while we, I think, have challenges with the Chinese government, with the Chinese population at large, I'm not sure we're quite there.
Can I just amend, and I should have said, you know, I think that I totally agree that this is not fundamentally changing their approach, and I don't think that, as I mentioned, the structural changes that they might have been willing to make back in the spring in some areas, although even those, you know, would have been a question of whether they'd have actually followed through and enforced them. We would have enforced them, but I think they've backed away from, and they're not going to do those things. And so I agree that in that sense, it's not having an impact. In a narrower sense, I think it is complicating things, and it's explaining why they're coming to the table for phase one. That's all I meant to say. Also, to Chad's last point, I totally agree that there's a risk here that it is hardening attitudes in China, and I think it's reinforcing more specifically not just what 1.4 billion, we're not just hurting the feelings of 1.4 billion Chinese, as the Chinese always say, but we're actually changing policy in a sort of hardening direction. I think they're more determined than ever to be to have indigenous innovation capabilities, to have independence from the reliance that others talked about here. So I think that is having that negative effect as well.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper?
Thank you, Congresswoman Murphy, for holding this panel, and I want to thank each one of the expert witnesses because I think this has been remarkably informative. I'm particularly pleased to have not only farmers, but retailers and computer folks all represented specifically because that shows the wide range of concerns here. It's dangerous to try to attempt to summarize the testimony of 5 different witnesses, but let me try this. It seems like each one of you wants to give credit to the Trump administration for having rung the fire alarm, because China is a genuine threat in many different ways. But it seems that each one of you is worried that our response to the fire is not necessarily putting out the fire. In fact, in some cases, could be counterproductive and actually spread the fire. So am I right in that assumption that China is a threat, and that should have been called out perhaps years ago, but we're not necessarily dealing with that threat in the appropriate way? Is that a fair summary? Okay. It seems to me that you also shared the view that tariffs, even though they may sound good, and there are certain industries in America that don't mind being protected by tariffs, but that tariffs are in fact taxes. So everyone agrees to that. So, and this isn't a tax passed by Congress, and the Constitution actually puts that responsibility in the hands of the House of Representatives because they wanted the taxing authority to be closest to the people so that we'd be reluctant to impose taxes. But it seems like this is a tax unilaterally imposed by the executive branch, and that is in fact being paid by the American people. Like, this is a tax that is not on foreigners. This is a tax on our own people. I think one of you gave the number, it's $38 billion so far. It's $2,300 per American family. Like, that's a lot. And it was passed without any law, or it's kind of unilaterally. And we don't know what's going to happen with these phases, but didn't you say phase 3 could kick in December 15th, right before the crucial Christmas season for our retailers? Like, wow. Why do we shoot ourselves in the foot like this? This is kind of an amazing story. And yet it seems like very few people back home really understand that. We're all mad at China, and that's great, but we want to be mad at China in an effective way so that we help ourselves. And it seems like we're not quite doing that. So what are better ways for us to express our anger toward China and to help the American consumer and farmer at the same time. Wouldn't that be nice? What policies would help us achieve that?
Go ahead.
Mr. Cooper, thank you for that comment, and I think in a way, I'll just speak for myself, but it really does sum up quite well the analysis that we've been doing. And I would just say it's the longer-term pernicious effects bear watching. It is the effect on the feelings of 1.4 billion Chinese. It's the larger effects it has on the image of the United States abroad. It is the legitimization of tariffs, this blunt instrument as a tool for resolving economic disputes. I mean, I worked at USTR in a past life, and I think whether it's trade agreements or any other agreement, people negotiating know every time you negotiate an agreement or do something, you're not just acting in the present, you're acting in the future. You're sending a signal to the rest of the world about what you stand for and what the right way to resolve issues is. And so the only other point I would add is that it's hard to overstate the importance of international coordination and cooperation on this. I mean, by my count, the United States accounts for maybe a quarter of global GDP. If you had the European Union and Japan and Korea and Australia and Canada, all of a sudden you're well over 50. You've got incredibly significant economic heft interacting with a China that, while it has a huge number of structural systemic problems in its economy and this instinct towards national preference, ultimately has some pragmatic streaks and understands its interests and can think long term. And so this is the last point I made, which is it's not too late. It can still be done, but we need to use those allies.
Ambassador?
I would just add there that our allies, when it comes to an area like agricultural trade, but not just agriculture, are also our fiercest competitors. And so if you look at a country like Brazil, the Brazilians have long felt that China's biotech approval policy or their lack of attention to the SPS agreement, those are common barriers into the Chinese market that are faced by both countries. Maybe not on the same products at the same time, but improving adherence to those rules in China or helping to build confidence in those products, that's a common problem because what our farmers want in both countries is predictability, that when their product hits the border, it's going to be treated in the same way, that when you have a problem, you know to whom you need to talk to solve it. We have a lot of common interests with other ag exporters, but right now, by using a tariff-based approach, China is playing us off against one another brilliantly. Their switch very quickly to protein products and to soy from Brazil has, sort of dampened, I think, the willingness to work together or the focus on barriers into that market. And again, they have a market of such a size that they can make a huge difference when they choose, again, to open or to close. But I think we have a lot of common interests in China's market, but in other markets where we could be working more strategically and effectively with allies in an efficient way.
I offered a sort of broad framing, but just to put an accent, I, again, agree with everything you said, Congressman Cooper. I do think we just did a big sort of game theory-based study of how a U.S. China trade war might escalate and the factors behind that. And one of the conclusions was that, if you want to be credible in this kind of war, you have to be willing to pay a price. So I do think that our being willing to pay a targeted sort of smart price is part of the dynamic here if we're going to get them to change. But it shouldn't be the sole single focus of what we're doing. So I think broad-based and certainly illegal tariffs are really problematic in this regard for economic and political reasons. I do think, to me, what I want to put an accent on is my sort of third bucket, which is the proactive strategy of going out with allies and trying to negotiate new rules of the road. I still think that's critically important, and I don't want to get into, unless you do, a debate about whether we should rejoin TPP, but personally, for what it's worth, I think we should. And if short of that, I think that we should be working with the Europeans and the Japanese in particular, Australians and a few others, on digital rulemaking. I think the digital space is one where the stakes are hugest, where we don't have established rules, where people are going in different directions, including us in Europe, in some cases over privacy and other things. Although, actually, I should say there may be some convergence, because I think the Europeans, having established this tough privacy standard, now realize maybe they need some commercial activity on top of that. And we're probably realizing that it can't be all about, just letting data flow. We have to have some bedrock or sensible regime of privacy and security and so forth. So there may be an opportunity to converge. Japan would be part of that conversation as well. In this area, we should be working through the G7, through the WTO, through other forums that we still have a lot of influence in, to try to shape those rules in our likeness, as opposed to letting the Chinese approach dominate. So there's some positive things we should be doing, not just defense.
Just to pick up a little bit more on the proactive in response to Congressman's question. So beginning in December of 2017, under the Trump administration, they have been actively engaging this trilateral process with the Europeans and the Japanese, largely to address the big fundamental issues with China on subsidies, state-owned enterprises, mistreatment of foreign investment, and intellectual property. They have been meeting, for the last 2 years. The USTR and the European and Japanese trade ministers have issued statements, joint statements at basically the quarterly frequency about the progress that they're making. But over the last 6 months or so, my understanding is their deliberations have kind of slowed down and taken a back seat to the bilateral tack with China. And I think that's a problem, because I think that's actually more proactive and more productive approach. But I think that our partners are both suffering from the waiting to be engaged, but also the mixed signals that they're getting out of the administration. When the administration sounds like it's putting priorities on, $40 or $50 billion worth of agricultural purchases, which may simply be diverted from their markets instead, that's one mixed signal. When they see the administration undermining other efforts at cooperation to strengthen institutions that might also be used to challenge China proactively, like the World Trade Organization, what the administration is doing by undermining the appellate body in the dispute settlement function. They received a missed message. And then finally, when your exporters get hit with steel and aluminum tariffs that are, a threat to America's national security, and there's this constant threat that you might get hit with tariffs on cars, that also makes it difficult to kind of engage and cooperate. So I think while the mechanism is there, and I agree it's not too late and it could be engaged, I think our partners have found it quite difficult to be engaged, and partially that's because the administration hasn't yet really sought their most active participation on this.
I just wanted to add, building off of what's been said, China has clearly taken the long view on how they're going to evolve their economy, and it's for us to offset that. We can't take exclusively a tariff-based approach that is built around discouraging trade with China, and instead we too need to take the long view and find other places where we can encourage trade, looking at existing trade agreements, GSP, other options where we can find other sources, perhaps to create a more diverse sourcing platform.
Mr. Costa?
Thank you, Representative Murphy. This is, I think, a very informative panel, and it seems to be a level of consistency among your thoughts. I'm one of those who have spent a bit of time engaged with the China effort and subscribe to the theory that no one wins a trade war, because I think everyone has leverage, as we all know. And all of you have said by the previous questions that you feel there's a better way, and I guess I would argue a bit differently. While the administration has used the hammer approach to get their attention through the use of the tariffs. Certainly the previous administration and even the Bush administration shouted out of the China's noncompliance, World Trade Organization rulings in which we won, in essence, and they failed to comply. I mean, their bad behavior has been going on now for 2 decades. That's not new. The Obama administration approach, of course, as we know, was TPP, and to have this larger alliance where half of the world's economy, more or less, would be brought to bear to get China to become a good actor and comply in a rules-based economy. Is that not the case? Would you agree? And so I guess there are a couple questions here that we have to ask. I mean, the Middle Kingdom, as you pointed out, Mr. Dodge, was it? The long term? They've always looked for the long term, and we need to look at the world in that fashion as well. And I think when you look inside China today and the changes, you have those that believe that who's in charge? Are the reformists in charge? Or certainly President Xi is not a reformist. And he used the efforts 2 years ago with state-owned enterprises, I believe, to consolidate his power, to eliminate the term limits between seeking or determining who had corruption between the state-owned enterprises and who didn't. Well, there were a lot of corruption on both sides, but he picked winners to consolidate, I think, his power. So who do you believe in the negotiations that we're dealing with are reformers that want to subscribe to a rules-based economy in China who we're negotiating with today? Do you believe President Xi's a reformer? Any of you?
Not in the sense that any of us would recognize as constructive in these terms. I think.
But do you believe there are some people? Huh?
No, I think that there are people who understand the importance of market-based mechanisms and rules. I think that space has, for those people, been quite constrained and narrowing over time. And I think you can still have conversations with people who get it, but who are constrained. And I would say we can't, in the same way that we hoped for that in the past. And I don't want to. I know there's sort of revisionism about whether we should have believed them back in 2001 and letting them in. I personally believe that was a smart strategy at the time, and there were real reformers who were committed to, for China's sake, to a more open, rules-based, market-based system, even with Chinese characteristics. But and I think that's changed. I think that space has really shrunk, and so I think we don't have the same.
But don't we have to look at that within the context of Phase 1 and Phase 2?
Yes, and that's why I don't have very high expectations for Phase 1, and I don't think there will be a Phase 2 in this administration, at least, in my opinion. But I do think that, however, in a bigger sense, as I mentioned, and Chad echoed as well, they know, they're smart enough to know that their economic model of heavy investment, export-led growth is not sustainable, has not been sustainable, and they need to shift to a more domestic consumption and services-based model, and that's going to require a different set of rules and standards for themselves. I think in a big sense they do understand that, and I think that if we can play into that either by our argumentation, but more likely by their own experience of stumbling as they try to deal with this transition to a new model that requires more of those sort of more rules-based, market-based mechanisms. I think there could be still a shift back. Remember, it was only 5-7 years ago that we were dealing with the pre-Xi Jinping administration that, well, not late Hu Jintao, but I'd say earlier Hu Jintao, and certainly before that, who were still committed broadly to reform and opening. I think we should still imagine a period 5-10 years from now when they've had enough struggles with this approach that they're taking now under Xi Jinping, that they realize they have to shift back in another direction. I think that's possible, and we want to do what we can to encourage that. But right now, it's a very
Yeah,
narrow space.
I don't know if some of you others would care to comment.
I largely agree with that analysis. I mean, I said this in my opening remarks that the field of vision for this problem, I think, is the next generation. It really is. And, you know, if one concludes that China will ultimately believe that it is in China's interest to completely decouple and separate itself from the rest of the global economy, then I think the battle is lost. I don't think, and I think most observers who know a lot more than I do, don't think that that is how China views its own interests, which is why it's so important to view the challenge in the context of that time frame, to understand that how China views the sustainability of its own model will turn on the extent and the breadth and the nature of the pressure that it receives from other countries. And to ultimately believe that there is this streak of pragmatism that we've seen in many ways over the last 40 years in China that has caused a lot of pretty impressive economic development and pulling people out of poverty, that will cause it to view itself as overall benefiting in the long term from being more of a partner and less of an antagonist in the global system. But I believe it has to be viewed at that level of generality and sort of long-term significance.
Well, my final question, I mean, is I'm told by folks in China that there'll only be a phase one probably because they're not certain this administration's going to be reelected, and so they're going to save for whatever the next administration may be. That's some of the pragmatic folks there. But is it not really the most difficult thing on this trade issue is the changes for the long term of the industrial espionage, the copyrights, the privacy and security issues that fundamentally are at the heart of trying to reach some agreements here versus the agricultural efforts? Because Ambassador Vetter, you and I have spoken before, and I'm one that believes, and I have a lot of significant agriculture in my area that really has some markets there and would like to get additional markets there. But it seems to me the Chinese play with that because they need the agriculture products and they can pay for it. That's the easy stuff. The harder stuff for them is their play in industrial espionage, copyrights, complying with those issues, privacy and security issues. I think that's far more difficult for the Chinese to comply with on a rules-based economy in which everyone's playing by the same rules than the ag trade issues, it seems to me.
Respond to that as well. Certainly agriculture is and will continue to be incredibly important around the world. We often, as an organization that represents technology companies primarily, we often describe the issues at stake as not being really technology policy issues at all. They're global competitiveness, innovation, and technological leadership issues, fundamentally. And so I'm saying that to I think, show agreement with your premise, and again, to remind us all of the span of time that we're talking about. It's incredibly important for the United States, not just for solely commercial reasons to increase exports and create jobs and do those important things, but also for broader technological leadership and security issues to make investments in this country, whether it's R&D, whether it's STEM education, whether it's infrastructure, but also to make those investments in the relationships around the world that are going to, it's not going to be neat, it's going to be very messy, but over time, over this next generation, to move the global discussion in a way that sort of provides oxygen for the pragmatists in China, provides opportunities for innovators and companies in the United States, supports technological leadership here, and gets ahead of these issues in a structural long-term way.
Ambassador Vetter?
I think certainly you're correct that some of the agricultural issues and the trade impediments we face, they have an easier power to solve. But some of the problems that have been more difficult in trade between us sort of reflect some of the same situations or problems we have on larger issues. And I
But they needed the commodities, and
right, in
and
terms
they have the money.
in terms of just sort of supply of food, right? They're going to find a way to get that somewhere, and they have power to sort of figure out who they're going to get it
The
from.
gray market.
But they get it from the gray market when they need to as well. And so I think that's absolutely right. But I think the future or the more of the value in our ag trade also has to do with things like protection of intellectual property, the ability for us to invest and deliver agricultural services, more and more thinking about how to carefully use our natural resources and still supply food of a sufficient quality and quantity will be based on good management of data. And so that foundation is absolutely important on the agricultural side as well. I will also say that, through many years of sitting down with my Chinese counterparts on some of the impediments that we were concerned about and things like food safety, they have some real internal management issues as well, and where they have resisted imports using growth promotants, for example. Part of their resistance is not a concern about a particular drug, it's that they don't know how they would use it in China and guarantee that it would be used safely. And lots of, mom and pop, very small level production where biosecurity, food safety can't be adequately enforced. And so figuring out how to create a domestic sector that is safe and modernized and professional, and therefore how to deal with imports coming in the case of the United States, from a sector that already employs a lot of those things, those are difficult tensions, and they affect movement out of rural areas into urban areas and become, economic inequality and security questions for them as well. And so, it's not just a matter of what happens at the border. They're thinking about how they want to and can govern, and that plays into some of the decisions they make about treatment at the border. So it's a difficult question, and they are going through massive economic transformation and trying to measure and keep a lid on lots of different competing interests.
Great, thank you. I'll go ahead and turn it to the audience if there are any questions from the audience members. Go ahead. Could the briefers repeat that question for the folks in the back when you answer it?
I think the key question is actively engaging this trilateral process that is sort of latent out there. What would it take? In my own view on this, I think Europe and Japan are waiting for the Trump administration to decide that this is something that they actively would like to pursue as a path toward addressing the issue. And I think that ultimately then, comes down to the president and the priorities that he puts on this. And so maybe that will be impacted by what comes out of the Phase 1 deal or the terms of the Phase 1 deal. We'll have to wait and see. But, as somebody else also said, trying to predict what the administration is going to do in terms of a strategy is hard. But I think it is also important to point out that this mechanism is there, and it seems to be ready to be grasped with both hands if they wanted to actively engage it. I think absolutely that would be be a challenge.
Definitely. I think I was in Europe, as I say, last weekend, and there's no question you hear from many European policymakers that they're, in a specific sense, that if that were to happen, if the Section 232 were to be levied on European automobiles, that would be sort of a deal breaker, or it certainly would, I think, hinder the ability to engage in cooperative efforts like that. And I'd say at a broader level, you also got a sort of general sense that the Europeans are really, certainly in Brussels context, they're really struggling with, they know they can't fall into China's arms beyond, wanting to sell things there. They get that, but they also are very uncomfortable with just following us, and they're trying to find, you hear a lot about assertive sovereignty or strategic sovereignty or something, where they're trying to find a third path, independent. And I'm not confident that that's going to happen for a lot of reasons because of European internal strains and challenges. But I do think there's a strong impulse right now to try to find a way between the two of us and not have to pick one or the other. So that would just reinforce that if we move forward with the 232s.
Thank you. Other questions? I'm going to repeat the question just because some folks in the back can't hear, and we're also live streaming it. But the question essentially was that Mr. Goodman said that he was skeptical there would be a phase 2 and didn't expect much out of phase 1. Does anybody on the panel disagree? And if you do, what was the mistake that the Trump administration made?
I'll take a stab at it. I can't really evaluate the accuracy of the assumption, though we are optimistic that the phase 1 deal will produce positive results. In terms of describing it as a mistake, I think perhaps it was a miscalculation to believe that tariffs alone were going to compel the behavior changes that were sought at the outset, because clearly they have not, despite escalating to the point of applying tariffs on virtually every product coming in from China. I think the sequencing of the products that were impacted by these tariffs reflected the belief of the administration that they could, as they said early on, impose the greatest pain on China and the least on American consumers. But we are deep into consumer products now, and those dynamics have changed, and the results have not. This has not compelled the results that have been sought in the first place.
I think it was a deeper strategic mistake in the sense that there wasn't a clear set into your first question, Congresswoman Murphy, about what the Trump administration's goals are. I still don't know. I mean, we're 3 years in or a year into the trade war, and I still don't know what the basic strategic goal is here. Is it to reduce the bilateral trade imbalance? Is it to make structural changes in China? Is it to contain or suppress China? I still don't know, and I think that's because there are different views on that within the White House, let alone the broader administration. And so I think that was the first problem.
I think you put your finger on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. I think the diagnosis of the patient's illness was not bad, but then they couldn't decide, do we try and make the patient better? Do we try and kill the patient? Do we cut off an arm or a leg? That's too quotable, I guess. I didn't ignore that, Doug.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Dan Pearson with Americans for Prosperity. Both the Bush and the Obama administrations brought a number of the current administration seems to have much less confidence in the WTO and hasn't really done much of that. Some scholars have suggested that quite a bit more could be done if the United States was willing to take a approach to the WTO. I know that former appellate body members Jim Backus and Dennis Miller both have written about it and Simon Lester and even
So the question was whether or not dispute settlement is an effective mechanism for trade enforcement.
So maybe I'll try to speak.
In summary.
I'll try to speak for that bound guy. So I'm very much of that view. I think we gave up on WTO dispute settlement too quickly. The Bush and Obama administrations brought dozens of disputes against China, won all of them for the most part, and China agreed and complied with most all of the legal rulings. There's a couple of exceptions. Electronic payments took forever on chicken feet, but by and large, the other ones, they ultimately were brought into line. Now, was it really annoying that we had to bring those cases and they didn't just follow through with all of these commitments without us having to bring disputes against them? Sure. But is that true with everyone? Absolutely. We do the same thing. Countries have to bring cases against us sometimes for us to get our policies into line. As Ambassador Vetter mentioned, the Trump administration did continue to pursue that dispute at the WTO on rice, corn, and wheat subsidies. They have continued to pursue the case against the Europeans on aircraft subsidies. But there's a lot of others that were begun at the tail end of the Obama administration that they haven't pursued. One on aluminum subsidies. A lot of others that they could have potentially pursued. So this argument that the WTO couldn't do enough on China, I don't buy that. There were not cases that were brought against China that we lost, where the WTO said, no, there's nothing in the rule book that says that China isn't allowed to do that thing. My view is we didn't try, and we gave up on the WTO too soon. Could it be engaged? I think. I'm not sure there's an interest in this administration in doing so, especially given the fact that they're undermining dispute settlement, as I mentioned before, by holding up the appointment of appellate body members. But I don't think writ large that the WTO, in that respect at least, didn't perform its function.
If I could add to that a little bit, having been part of the process to bring that case on subsidies for rice, corn, and wheat, one of the hardest things about building that case is the lack of transparency in China. And that the rules that they're using or their requirements for their state trading enterprises to buy domestic first before they can get an import license might not be a law, even if it's a policy. And so tracking that all down, getting that information translated, connecting the dots as to what were really the internal reasons why their quotas for imports of those products were not filling, that was a multi-year enterprise to bring the case. But once brought, the transparency that brought into how China is operating its system, the number of countries then that said, yes, we're having the same problem, this is really helpful. Again, I think the dispute settlement body is important in terms of winning cases. It's also important in building those alliances and helping to pinpoint and bring a little bit of sunshine to policies that have been very difficult to ascertain or to figure out how they work to suppress trade in the first place. And so the process of bringing them in many cases identifies allies, helps figure out what you need to do to address them, and I do think it could be used much more. And again, when we do bring them, the record is pretty good in terms of winning them and actually getting compliance related to those findings.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we're about out of time, so I just wanted to wrap up and just say thank you to the briefers, to the members, and to the public for joining us for this conversation. I think it was a great opportunity to shed some light on a really important issue that has far-ranging economic and foreign policy implications. And while it seems like the strategy isn't quite clear and we're not sure whether we're making progress towards the intended outcome, we certainly are experiencing significant tax and trade implications here in the United States with real consequences for American businesses and the American public. And but there might still be a better way and an opportunity for us to course correct so that we do get to the desired outcome. And I think all that's to say that this is a topic that deserves more conversation, more attention, and more public discourse. And I certainly appreciate you all being here with us today to have that conversation. Thanks so much, and I hope everyone has a great day.